Today we're talking about Guardians in the jungle. Now, as many of you know, some players, even in the SPL, have played Guardians in the jungle in the past. Typically you'll see assassins in the jungle, sometimes you see warriors, and even more rarely you'll see guardians. There are only a few guardians that really have kits suited for this and that allow to do this. The ones in question are primarily Athena, following behind that Cabrakan and Ymor, and then there are the outliers Kumbhakana and Bacchus. Kumbhakana having seen play in the SPL once, and Bacchus just generally being liked by some people as a jungle god, albeit not being all too efficient. So with these 5 gods in mind, let's think about and look at how a guardian in jungle functions, what is different compared to, for example, warriors or even assassins, and what needs to be considered in your team comp, what needs to be considered in your playstyle, and so on. First of all, what you have to keep in mind, or what is generally necessary to know about guardians, is many of them have very high base damage values and relatively low scalings. This means that power on them doesn't do all too much, because scalings is what allows you to work very well with power items. However, base damage means that penetration will work very well for you, because penetration directly helps your base damage in the sense that if you, for example, have 400 base damage, it's reduced to 300 via the enemy's protection, then penetration will work against that and bring you back up to 350, for example, just to throw out some numbers there. So in that regard, both flat penetration as well as percentage penetration help guardians to really bring their damage through that they have. This is also kind of important when you think about how a guardian clears in the jungle. Now, ideally, a guardian works very closely with his team when clearing. Ideally, a guardian hardly ever clears a camp on his own, and instead clears everything with the mid laner, with the solo laner, with the duo lane, and then sticks around lanes otherwise and looks for kill opportunities. That way, you're not that dependent on items for clear. Now, this is in an ideal scenario, and obviously that won't happen every game. Sometimes your allies will just not follow you to camps, and you will have to clear them on your own. This in itself is a problem for guardians, because then it takes a lot longer for them to clear the camps, as they often don't have the basic attack damage that, for example, an assassin would have, and it just takes longer to swing down a camp. What helps you in that regard is obviously some level of damage, penetration, and cooldown reduction. Now, you don't need endless amounts of those stats for clear, especially since the jungle creeps typically don't get too much magical protection over time, but it's still important to have at least some just to be able to clear effectively. Likewise, you're required to use your early aggression for ganks, and therefore the penetration is very important, as it will allow you to maximize your damage early on, because the longer the game goes, the more you fall off in regards to damage, simply because you don't have the scalings that other gods would have. Dynasty playtime is typically the go-to items for most jungle guardians, simply because it allows you to aggress onto the enemy jungler more, especially when he's physical. It allows you to take more damage from both waves as well as jungle camps, and it also gives you a decent amount of extra damage. Therefore, often a second choice after the boots. As with our Kwang basically, who follows the same kind of concept and then goes into more burst. Now, the build dependence here kind of shows something, and that's that a guardian in the jungle is a little different from a guardian in the solo lane. In the solo lane, it's a little easier to go for more cooldown reduction focus builds and simply not rely as much on early clear and accept the fact that you're going to miss a few waves, and then over time build up your build so you can clear effectively and without too much risk. That is not the same in the jungle, and that means that in the jungle you're gonna end up being a less tanky guardian than you would be in the solo lane most of the time, simply because your build doesn't allow for the same kind of full-on defense items. For example, maybe you can build Height of the Urchin in the jungle or Breastplate of Valor, but you're hardly ever gonna be able to build both and still be as effective as you should be in that role. It is just important for a jungler to have that damage, to have that early threat potential, because otherwise the main role, the main purpose of the jungle early is completely gone. That means that you have to make a choice. Either you put a third tanky character in the solo lane, as you would usually, and have another warrior or guardian there. Or you go for a hyper carry in solo and only have your jungler as your secondary frontline character. If you do that, then you have to keep in mind that the guardian from the jungle will not be as much of a frontliner as a solo laner would, which means that your late game is gonna be significantly weakened. In late game, your jungler will not have the same damage that most other junglers would have, and he will not be able to frontline as well. He will still have the same control and that kind of stuff, but it would require a lot of build changes to actually adapt to that kind of purpose in the late game, which will be costly and take a while to transition over. At the same time, going with 3 frontliners means sacrificing a lot of damage, and that can easily be a problem as well. So both options kinda require a team comp that really works around that, something that has to be communicated. Maybe do 2 half frontliners by having a solo laner that builds into a more aggressive build later on or stuff like that. There is a notable exception, and that's Cabrakan. Now obviously Cabrakan, not the strongest jungler at the moment, and tends to fall off to some extent late game as well, because if you go for a more aggressive build, he will be easy to lock down. But Cabrakan works incredibly well with a high burst combo with Soul Reaver and Polynomica and stuff like that, or just a high penetration build and then a Soul Reaver on top of that, stuff like that. Really allow him to burst a lot more than others, and often he can blow up squishies late game without even giving them the window to get out unless they have their beats up. And that's something that's worth keeping in mind. That's something that only Cabrakan can do to that level, because his lockdown is so strong and it's also a damaging tool at the same time, meaning you can really deal a lot of damage before the enemy can react to it. So Cabrakan is a little bit of an outlier, but then again, he's also easy to shut down if he goes for a very damage-focused build, and therefore, once again, not the same kind of late-game frontliner that a solo lane Cabrakan would be. All in all, I would highly recommend trying out some jungle guardians. I think they're extremely fun to play, and it's got a bit of an element of surprise, even though Athena jungle is a bit more expected now. They have some other advantages, like for example the rotational speed of Athena, which allows you to basically gank 2 lanes right after each other on the other side of the map before the enemy jungler can follow up. Keep in mind that there are downsides. It works better when you have a team, or at least a mid laner with you that you can coordinate with. It works better when your team knows about beforehand, so you can structure the solo lane and stuff as follows, so that works in synergy. And you should try and get some aggression and lead going early on, because if you get to very late game, you usually struggle a bit more. That's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching. Feel free to point out more unusual junglers that you like to play in the comments down below. Other than that, I will hopefully see you all tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out!